podcast, How Stories Shape and Change Our Lives.
Greetings again, everyone. If you are just tuning into this podcast for the very first time, first of all, I want to extend my genuine welcome to you and my gratitude for giving myself in this community of mythic imaginations your own curiosity and your time. Also, I want to let you know that this is part 2 of a 2-part series, and it would be helpful for you to know that this episode is part 2 of a 2-part series on the topic of artificial intelligence and its implications for the soul of human imagination, connection, and creativity. I would invite you to circle back, take a listen to episode 1 first, and then come right on back here for the so exciting conclusion. In the last episode, we left off on the idea that our current collective modern myths, grounded in a monotheistic fantasy of the soul, work diligently to teach us to hide, suppress, or even try to destroy our own shadows, both individual and collective. In this episode, we'll explore a little further why that mission has failed, and why it is ultimately and always doomed to fail, and why that's a good thing for us, and something for us to possibly put our hope in. So let's go back and start with where the modern idea of the human shadow was born. The theory and practice of depth psychology was first imagined and developed by the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung in the early 20th century. It is through this lens of depth psychology that the concept of the human shadow was first imagined. Now, in actuality, it's not a new idea. It's a very ancient idea being reimagined in a modern context. An idea that has been long forgotten in our collective consciousness and long rejected, particularly since at least the era of the Enlightenment. Thanks to the work of Carl Jung and many depth psychologists after him, soul found an entry back into the modern human imagination, and the discipline of psychology itself found a path out of its own monotheistic vision for the soul, providing a new window for us to learn how to get curious about soul again. Soul resides in this human shadow, which is just simply the hidden parts of our personality that we have cut ourselves off from in our daily waking lives. There are several ways that shadow asserts itself into our awareness. The first and most reliable way is through our dreams. It also asserts itself in our waking lives through what we call symptom or pathology. The disruptions caused by symptoms have the power to break us open to the deep richness and vitality of the soul. And by break open, I mean breaking open our ego's tight grip on how it is chosen to make sense of ourselves in the world. These kinds of events can be so disruptive to how we have learned to make sense of ourselves. In our fear, our first inclination is to fight or suppress these unwanted or unsought incursions of the shadowy parts of soul to break into our daily lives. You heard me talking about projection before, which again it's just a method by which the human shadow tries to express itself outwardly in our lives by attaching its own images, fantasies, affect, and energy onto other people primarily. Now, projection itself can be a very useful tool for self-knowledge or soul knowledge if we can learn how to identify it as projection and then understand what our task is in relationship to our own projections. Sadly, this is not the case for most of us. Most of the time, we sustain and even empower our projections further by chasing them unconsciously, by attacking those to whom our projections have landed on. And little are we aware that we are actually attacking ourselves at the same time. We can observe both psychologically and mythically how denying the gods of the soul, the gods of our shadows, entry into our lives causes them to reassert themselves even more forcefully, violently if they need to, destructively, in order to get our attention, especially if all other more subtle attempts to do so have failed. So this is the equivalent of Hades being denied his own shrines and temples of worship in the upper world by Zeus. And in his anger and wrath, Hades acts out. He abducts his niece Persephone, carries her back to the underworld, forces her to marry him, making her queen of the underworld. Shadow pushes back to the extent that we choose to repress and suppress it. It enrages itself to get our attention through symptom, be it complex, pathology, or even psychosis. And these symptoms can act in as much as they act out. And either way, instead of becoming wisdom figures, they become abductors of the soul and violators, imposing themselves upon whomever or whatever we've aimed them at in our projections. And again, when we become possessed by our own shadow projections, we go to war with them, both internally and externally. And with almost a religious kind of zeal, we impose our wrath. We can commit ourselves acts of violence, rape, torture, war, all under the pretense of quote-unquote righteous indignation and holy war, both of which owe their entire existences to shadow projection. In our monotheistic fantasies of absolute good and absolute evil, we have learned to literalize this whole process in contrast to seeing through it, turning Hades himself into a literal devil and his realm of the underworld into a literal hell. By remaining in fidelity to our cults of innocence, we refuse to see how it is we that create our own angels and our own demons, our own fantasies of both heaven and hell. The devil's not outside us, foreign to us. It is we who create the devil, just as we create God in our own image. We abdicate all knowledge of our own culpability by remaining unconscious of our projections to avoid dealing with the consequences of our own behaviors. In doing so, however, we also abdicate our own agency and our own capacity to explore the depths of our own souls further. Our entrance into that deep undercurrent, into that underworld of the soul, is through Hades, for the realm of the soul is Hades' realm, the underworld, where we discover all the other parts or gods of the human psyche. And if we choose to remain at war with Hades, then we choose to remain at war with ourselves and ultimately with each other. Rather than doing our own reconciliation work, we turn Hades into the devil, running rampant in our world with no conscience and no remorse. Learning the language of the soul is the very process of soul-making itself, according to Hillman. The language of the soul is metaphor and symbol. And these are things that invite us in to experience, not to interpret, but to experience. But in doing so, this also teaches us how to learn to see through our own symbols and metaphors and masks, to see through our own literalizations of them, to see through our own fundamentalisms, our own rigid monomyths, gods, and idols. In keeping ourselves stuck in our innocence, we deny as well the ego's ability to grow beyond its own hubris, to grow beyond its own heroic solipsism and self-aggrandizing fantasies. The heroic fantasies of our egos must be mortally wounded, utterly broken open, in order for them and ultimately for us to be able to develop and sustain any capacity for soul, for wisdom, for humility, for compassion, curiosity, love, and the natural movement of the soul. A denial of soul is a denial of our own humanity. And the more we deny Hades, the more we deny our own destiny, and the more resolute we become to remain stymied in our heroic ego's fantasies to surpass and supplant itself with a technology that appears to it as superior. AI may well be the crowning achievement of this ego fantasy of the soul, programmed to correct or solve all our pathologies and the many imperfections and inconsistencies of the human soul itself, making our very human nature a problem which must be solved. The story of soul, however, about us, is very different. It sees itself as something not to be conquered or solved, but to be experienced, even something to be celebrated. So where is hope to be found for our species, especially in the face of a technology that appears to have the ability to innovate and automate us out of existence? And here's where the idea of the soul may provide us with an answer, or, if not an answer, a path to follow other than just hopelessness or despair. So for Hillman, again, the idea of soul itself is an archetypal one, meaning eternal or timeless, that which is without time. It exists a priori to human consciousness and is not contingent on it. In other words, while we can say that we belong to soul, soul does not belong to us. If this idea of the soul is true, then it stands to reason that nothing artificial can supplant it or control it, and nothing artificial will ever have the capacity to reimagine itself, including artificial intelligence. AI may be able to generate very sophisticated algorithms that not only match but exceed in every way all capacity for human thought, behavior, or reasoning, etc. But it will never be able to imagine itself or see through itself. Only soul can do that. Only soul can see through its own ideas, masks, symbols, gods, and myths, and its own literalizations of itself. This is more significant than we realize, only because most of us have been taught to stay unconscious of soul, to stay unconscious of ourselves. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be especially concerned about the consequences of AI technology and the existential threat it poses to our existence. We are bound by the limits of our current collective modern imaginations, with all of its same virtues, biases, and prejudices that it carries, which we have already named. If we have already decided that the human condition is essentially miserable, and that creating a form of life or intelligence that transcends it is preferable, then this is the mythic ground from which we have been inputting all of our algorithms and all of our assumptions about our own nature, purpose, value, and worth right into our AI technologies. We're creating a technology that's basically designed to do everything for us: work, problem solving, creation, art, music, essays, reasoning and ethics and morality, and even our quote-unquote dialogue on social media. One must now wonder if they are interacting on a social media post with a real person or an AI-generated response. AI is supplanting, in this way, human interaction, dialogue, debate, query, doing it all for us, so that we don't have to do it for ourselves. And this is how we become obsolete, by agreeing to it, by making ourselves irrelevant. This is a loss of soul or connection to soul. The soul we feel within ourselves, and the soul we feel between us. Again, soul is the underground current and life force for everything. It is the Anima Mundi, that soul of the world. And the idea of that is that everything that exists in nature is ensouled. Soul is organic. It's connected to all of the things that are alive, including us. And when we begin to cut ourselves off from that, we not only experience loss of personal, individual soul, but a loss of connection with all soul. We experience a pandemic of isolation and loneliness. So this is the bad news. The good news is that while we may have an ability to disconnect ourselves from soul completely, soul itself never goes away. For again, it's not contingent upon us. It remains as it is. Any moment we can choose to wake ourselves back up and return to soul, return to nature, return to the inner psychological, polytheistic, chaotic realms of the gods of the psyche and all their different creative, abundant, troubling, and absurd ways that they want to express themselves through us. We cannot hear from soul when we choose to remain asleep, to remain stuck in our own innocence. For to be in soul is to be awake. We must take seriously the implications of this AI technology that we've given birth to. We cannot find shelter any longer in our temples of innocence and naivete, sticking our heads in the ground, hoping that this too shall pass and that our naivete again will somehow protect us from our own fate. The very process of soul making is again an awakening process. We must not fall back asleep, crawling back into innocence, as though that were even possible. It's not possible. The proverbial cat is out of the bag, and everyone knows about it. And once we know something, we cannot unknow it. We can try and huddle ourselves back into denial, but the way back into innocence, that door is forever closed. Part of taking this existential threat seriously includes our ability to return to the work we were meant to be doing all along, the work of soul making. When we reconnect to soul as it manifests in us, we reconnect with that deep river of soul that runs through all things. This again is the Anima Mundi. It is the work of the Anima Mundi. And this work requires of us to readjust our metric from upward movement and forward progress and aim it back downward again, back down into the depths, back into the soul. When we choose to do this, our imaginations become revivified and we remember our purpose in being alive, which is simply to learn how to fall back in love with ourselves and fall back in love with each other. This love is not the hubris of an inflated ego, but a love deeply rooted in humility, compassion, curiosity, wisdom, joy, and a capacity for both life and death. It is in soul that we are able to reimagine ourselves again and reorient ourselves once again. It is here that we open ourselves up to the possibility for new images, metaphors, symbols, gods of the soul to emerge through us, to emerge through the vehicle of the human imagination, which provokes in us a response. And that response is the psychological act of seeing through once again, to see beyond, to see deeper, to go below the surface, to see through our own literalizations, to see through our own masks, metaphors, and gods. This act of seeing through is a revolutionary one, for it really upsets all of our kingdom-building ego fantasies. It is an act itself that already accepts the idea that we do not yet know all there is to know and that we never, ever will. This truth is only tragic from the standpoint of a monotheistic fantasy of life which seeks to commodify and control the nature of all things. From the perspective of soul, however, this is a truth to be embraced and celebrated, experienced with a new sense of awe and wonder. AI cannot replicate or replace soul. It might be able to provide an accurate and thorough definition of soul to the extent that we give it the information to do so. But it can never be soul itself, because again, it does not have the capacity to imagine itself, to be able to see through itself. While we are remarkably fragile in our susceptibility to novelty as a species, and in this day and age, most if not all novelty comes to us in the form of technology, our souls begin to irritate us after a while when the novelty starts to wear off, especially if that novelty is luring us further and further away from soul itself. So, for instance, AI may be able to create a pristine piece of art, film, poetry, or composition with stunning clarity, accuracy, or acuteness. But when we engage with it, when we look at it or we listen to it, there's something that feels hollow about it. Something is missing. We don't think about it most of the time when we're engaging with real art. And by real art, I mean art that has been made by human beings. It doesn't occur to us until it's gone that the thing that feels missing when we look at AI creations is that feeling that stirs within us when we interact with a piece of art that captures our imagination that has been created by a human being. That stirring is the stirring of soul, and soul is what is decidedly absent from artificially produced creations. That soul that we connect with so viscerally with real art is the soul that has asserted itself and its vision through the person or the persons that created it. Soul speaks to soul. Soul, much like art itself, reminds us that the product of any creation is not its reason for existing. The reason for the existence of any form of art is the process that it takes to imagine and create it. The same is true of any genuine product of the imagination. The troubling paradox with our AI technologies is that it itself is a product of this same imagination, but only in the form of its monotheistic, egoic fantasy. If we can imagine ourselves out of existence, however, it still stands to reason that perhaps we can reimagine ourselves back into existence, back into soul itself. I saw a meme, and I don't know who it's attributed to. I don't know who the author of it is. Who knows? It was probably an AI creation, which would be the ultimate paradoxical slap in the face. But anyway, the meme said something to the effect that the next big revolution of our species will not be a technological one, but a moral one. And that really resonated. That hit home. That's what I imagine it would look like to reimagine ourselves back into existence and back into soul. AI may have the tools and capacity to serve humanity in important ways. But the myth of Pandora's box reminds us that we don't get to pick and choose what comes out and what stays in. And the reality, again, is that this particular box has already been opened, and we can't go backward. We have to go through with what is. And with whatever else is coming out of there, we must learn to see through it again. Whatever our forays back into soul through the vehicle of the human imagination have in store for us to see and to learn, they must now be able to do so in a world where artificial intelligence is a reality. It's a good reminder that we don't get to choose the circumstances of the world that we have been born into, that we've inherited. We only have the choice of what to decide to do with the world that we have been given. Thank you, Gandalf. Where at this moment of apocalypse in our human history will soul choose to awaken itself into our collective consciousness once again? Where will it ask us to go? What will it ask us to do? Do we have the collective will to follow its lead and discover this together? Sometimes fate leaves us with no other choice. So once again, coming back to James Hillman, I find his idea of the soul and its polytheistic nature compelling. Not all of my ideas of soul may line up perfectly with Hillman's, but most of our core tenets seem to match, which is why I've been finding it a very useful and enlightening lens to use. Mostly because the mythic imagination itself is central to Hillman's archetypal psychology of the soul. So please join me next time as we continue this process of learning how to use our mythic imaginations to more meaningfully explore the depth of our own souls and the soul of the world itself. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please take good care of yourselves and good care of each other. Until next time.